13 months, 102 floors, 1931. One World Trade Center took 8 years. Same city, shorter building. The Empire State Building rose at 4 floors per week. Steel arrived on rail cars each morning. Riveters installed it by noon. No storage, no delays. Fifth Avenue never closed. Today, the environmental review alone takes longer than the entire construction took then. 60,000 tons of steel, 10 million bricks, assembled faster than we can now get a permit approved. They had no computers, no laser levels, no safety harnesses. Men walked on 6-inch beams at 1,000 feet. Some fell. 5 died officially. Maybe 17 actually. The building still stands. We added decades to the timeline. We call it progress. They traded bodies for speed. We traded speed for safety. Neither exchange was honest about the price. The price was physics. A skyscraper is a war against gravity. Every ton of steel wants to crush the steel below it. Every gust of wind wants to topple the whole structure sideways. At 1,454 feet, the Empire State Building would weigh 365,000 tons when finished. That mass would press down on the bedrock with 20,000 pounds per square foot. The wind at the top would hammer the facade with 200 pounds per square foot during storms. Conventional construction would have killed the project before the 10th floor. The standard method in 1930 was this: order steel, store it in staging yards, block traffic for months, wait for inspectors, coordinate 17 different trades, argue about dimensions, cut beams on site, drill holes with hand tools, then hoist. The Metropolitan Life Tower took 4 years using this method. The Woolworth Building took 3. Both were shorter. Both had smaller footprints. Both nearly bankrupted their builders. The Empire State had 13 months. The lease arrangements demanded it. The investors demanded it. The propaganda value of tallest building during the Depression demanded it. Alfred E. Smith, the former governor fronting the project, needed the ribbon cutting before the 1932 election cycle, so they invented a new machine. Not the building, the process. If you could X-ray the construction site, you'd see a circulatory system. Steel flowing like blood. 5 railroad siding tracks ran directly to the elevator bases. Freight cars pulled in at 6 a.m. Trucks unloaded structural beams onto the tracks. The tracks fed the construction elevators. The elevators rose at 1,000 feet per minute. The beams reached the installation floor 18 minutes after leaving the rail car. 0 storage, 0 staging yards, 0 blocked streets. Every beam was prefabricated at the mill in Pittsburgh, pre-cut to length, pre-drilled for rivets, numbered like surgery tools. Beam A47 had exactly 1 location in the structure. The holes in A47 lined up exactly with the holes in column B12 and crossbeam C22. No measuring on site, no cutting, no adjustment. The steelworkers were assembly line workers positioned vertically. 4-man riveting crews worked in relay teams. The heater cooked rivets in a portable forge to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Cherry red. He tossed the rivet 40 feet through the air. The catcher snagged it in a metal cone. Bare hands. The bucker-up shoved it through the pre-drilled holes and held the tail end with a steel bar. The riveter hammered the head flat with a pneumatic gun that weighed 60 pounds and screamed at 130 decibels. Each rivet took 90 seconds. Each floor required 30,000 rivets. The math was unforgiving. But the math worked because the system eliminated every wasted motion. Conventional construction had workers waiting for materials, waiting for coordination, waiting for decisions. The Empire State had materials waiting for workers. The steel arrived the morning it was needed. Not the day before, not the week before. The morning. If you were 5 floors up, your beam was already in the elevator. Paul Sterrett, the site superintendent, ran the operation like a general. He divided the structure into vertical zones. Each zone had a dedicated derrick. Each derrick had a dedicated crew. Each crew worked one floor ahead of the masonry teams. The skeleton stayed 5 floors ahead of the skin. This created a cascading rhythm. While riveters sealed floor 30, masons were bricking floor 25. While electricians wired floor 20, plumbers were fitting pipe on floor 15. While painters finished floor 10, marble masons were polishing the lobby. 5 separate construction waves moving upward in parallel. No single bottleneck could stop the machine. The steel frame rose at 4.5 floors per week. Peak speed was 1 floor every 3.5 days. That included columns, beams, riveting, and safety inspections. The skeleton of the tallest building in the world climbed faster than most people paint a house. The secret was in what they didn't do. They didn't consult, they didn't committee review, they didn't hold coordination meetings. The architect drew the plans. The engineers calculated the loads. The fabricators cut the steel. The contractors installed it. If something didn't fit, the foreman made the call in 10 seconds. Grind it down, shim it up, make it work, move on. This was only possible because the tolerance for error was invisible. If you X-rayed a modern skyscraper during construction, you'd see gaps, pauses, safety buffers built into every joint, inspections between every phase, documentation at every step. The physical construction is maybe 40% of the timeline. The other 60% is proving you built it correctly. The Empire State had one city building inspector. He showed up twice a week. He looked at the steel. He checked the rivets with a hammer. If the rivet rang clear, it was good. If it rang hollow, they drilled it out and replaced it. He signed off in 15 minutes. The crew went back to work. Today, One World Trade Center had inspectors from 19 different agencies: structural engineers, fire, safety engineers, environmental engineers, accessibility consultants, wind consultants, security consultants. Each one required documentation. Each one could stop the work. Each one added weeks. The Empire State engineers weren't smarter. They just had permission to move. And the building didn't care about permission. It cared about physics. The steel frame handled the compression load. The columns were spaced every 20 feet. The outer curtain wall was non-load-bearing, revolutionary for 1930. This meant the facade was just a skin. You could punch windows anywhere. You could change the facade later. The skeleton did all the work. If you peeled back the limestone and brick, you'd see the truth. The building is a rigid core surrounded by a lightweight shell. The core takes the weight. The frame takes the wind. The skin keeps out the weather. It's 3 structures pretending to be one. And it still stands. 94 years later, no major structural repairs. The steel hasn't sagged. The frame hasn't shifted. The building survived a B-25 bomber flying into the 79th floor in 1945. The impact sheared through columns. The fire burned for hours. The building didn't fall. They patched the hole and reopened the floor 3 months later. We couldn't get the environmental waiver approved in 3 months today. The Empire State proved something we've since forgotten. Speed doesn't require recklessness. It requires ruthless coordination. The engineering wasn't unsafe. The engineering was meticulous. Every beam was calculated. Every rivet was specified. Every load was measured. What they eliminated wasn't safety. They eliminated deliberation. They didn't debate whether the building could be built. They calculated how to build it, then built it. But buildings don't build themselves. It took an army. 3,400 men on site simultaneously. September 1930. Peak deployment. They weren't there because they loved skyscrapers. They were there because the alternative was starvation. Unemployment sat at 30% in New York City, higher in the outer boroughs. Men lined up 50 deep for a single job opening. Starrett Brothers, The general contractor could fire anyone and replace them by lunch. Everyone knew it. The foreman knew it. The workers knew it. It made the entire operation frictionless. Paul Sterrett ran the site like a wartime general, not because he was cruel, because war was the only organizational model that worked at this speed. He divided the building into vertical battle zones. Each zone had a commander. Each commander had absolute authority. No appeals, no committees. A foreman could hire you at 7 a.m. and fire you at 9 a.m. if you couldn't keep pace. Decisions were made in seconds, not sessions. A beam doesn't fit? Grind it. A rivet fails? Replace it. A worker gets injured? Send him down and pull the next man from the line. The building didn't stop. Stopping cost $10,000 per day in $1930. Stopping meant the investors lost confidence. Stopping meant Alfred E. Smith looked weak heading into an election. Stopping was not an option. So nothing stopped. 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Christmas Day was the only holiday. Not Thanksgiving, not Easter, not the 4th of July. One day. The construction log shows 364 days of work in the first year. No weather delays were tolerated. They built through rain. They built through snow. They built through heat waves. In summer, the steel reached 140 degrees. Workers wore gloves that fell apart by noon. In winter, the wind chill at 1,000 feet dropped below zero. Frostbite was routine. Nobody complained. Replacement was instant. The workday started at 7 a.m., not 7:05. The gates opened at 6:30. Men lined up. The foreman walked the line and pointed. You, not you. The selected men went to their stations. The rejected men went home, or waited to see if someone got hurt. Sometimes they got their chance by 9 a.m. The workforce was organized in cascades. 800 steel workers formed the tip of the spear. These were the riveters, the bolters, the high steel men. Many were Mohawk ironworkers from Kanawake, outside Montreal. Mohawks had been building New York's bridges and skyscrapers since the 1890s. They had a reputation for fearlessness at height. The reputation was earned. They walked on 6-inch beams at 1,000 feet like other men walk on sidewalks. Behind the steelworkers came 600 masons and bricklayers, Italians mostly, immigrants who learned the trade in the old country. They laid 10 million bricks in 13 months. The math is 25,000 bricks per day, every day, no gaps. They worked from scaffolding that hung off the steel frame. If the scaffold shifted, you grabbed the beam. If you couldn't grab the beam, you fell. Behind the masons came 400 electricians. They wired as the walls went up. No waiting for the structure to finish. Wiring happened in parallel. Then came the plumbers, the carpenters, the plasterers, the painters, the marble masons. 1,600 men in supporting trades. Each trade stayed 5 floors behind the one in front. Like a factory line, bent vertical. At the bottom was the logistics operation. Truck drivers, crane operators, freight elevator operators, material handlers. These men never got famous. But without them, the whole machine stopped. They worked overnight shifts preparing the next day's materials. Steel beams sorted by floor number, bricks stacked by zone, pipes bundled by specification. Everything staged so the morning crews could grab and go. Communication happened through whistles. Different patterns meant different commands. 3 short blasts, emergency stop. 1 long blast, shift change. 2 short, 1 long, inspector on site. The workers learned the codes in the first week or they didn't last. Radio communication didn't exist. Shouting didn't work over the rivet guns. Whistles carried. The foremen were the linchpins. They weren't managers in the modern sense. They were battlefield sergeants. Most had come up through the trades. They knew how long each task should take because they'd done the task 1,000 times. If a riveting crew was running slow, the foreman knew within 10 minutes. He'd walk over. Watch for 30 seconds. Identify the problem. Fix it or replace the man causing it. There were no performance reviews, no improvement plans. You either kept pace or you left. The pace was inhuman, but it was also transparent. Every worker could see the steel rising. Every worker could count the floors. You knew if you were winning or losing. The building itself was the scoreboard. Starrett Brothers paid skilled iron workers $1.92 per hour. That's roughly $35 per hour in 2024 dollars. Sounds generous until you realize the work was 6 days a week, no benefits, no safety net, no unemployment insurance if you got fired. And the jobs were temporary. Once the building topped out, most men were gone. There was no loyalty in either direction. The company used you up. You used the paycheck to survive. Transaction complete. The workers lived scattered across the city. Most took the subway. The IRT line had just opened, connecting the outer boroughs to Midtown. Men commuted an hour each way. Some lived in flop houses in Hell's Kitchen or the Bowery. 25 cents per night bought you a cot in a room with 30 other men. No privacy. No security. You kept your money in your shoes. Some lived with family. Multi-generational apartments in tenements. 3 families sharing 4 rooms. The Depression had collapsed the housing market, but evictions were constant. If you missed rent, you were out. The Empire State paycheck was survival itself. Men tolerated conditions they wouldn't have accepted in 1928 because 1928 was gone. This was 1930. The rules had changed. The site operated under a principle modern construction has forgotten. Authority flows down, never up. The architect designed. The engineer calculated. The contractor executed. The foreman commanded. The worker obeyed. There were no input sessions, no worker councils, no safety committees staffed by workers. If you had a concern, you told the foreman. He made the call. His call was final. This sounds tyrannical. It was, but it was also fast. Today, One World Trade Center had union stewards, safety committees, worker liaisons, OSHA inspectors, third-party safety consultants, and mandatory stop-work authority for any crew member who felt unsafe. Every one of those roles was created for good reason. Workers died when they had no voice. Workers got maimed when speed was the only value. The changes were moral progress. But moral progress has a speed cost. The Empire State Site had one safety inspector. He worked for the city. He showed up twice a week. One World Trade Center had continuous safety monitoring, daily reports, incident documentation, and multi-agency oversight. The Empire State Safety budget was roughly 2% of total cost. One World Trade Center's safety and compliance budget was estimated at 18%. The difference isn't that modern workers are more careful. The difference is that modern workers are required to prove they're being careful. The work happens. Then the documentation of the work happens. Then the verification of the documentation happens. Each layer adds time. The Empire State didn't document. They built. If the rivet was tight, you moved to the next rivet. You didn't photograph it, log it, file it, and archive it. The building was the documentation. If it stood, the work was good. And the building stood because the organizational machine was perfectly calibrated to the technical machine. The steel delivery system required the workforce to be ready exactly when the steel arrived. The workforce was ready because the foreman had absolute authority to make them ready. The foreman had authority because the company had unlimited replacement labor. The company had unlimited labor because the Depression had shattered the economy. The building rose on desperation as much as steel. But desperation doesn't install rivets, men do, and some of those men didn't make it home. 5 men died officially. That's the number Starrett Brothers reported to the press. 5 deaths across 13 months of construction. The New York Times printed it. Architectural journals celebrated it. The building's promoters used it as proof that speed and safety could coexist. The actual number was probably 17. The discrepancy wasn't a lie exactly. It was accounting. If a worker fell from the 52nd floor and died on impact, that counted. If a worker fell from the 52nd floor, hit the safety net, broke his back, and died in the hospital 3 days later, that didn't count. Not an on-site death. If a steelworker at the fabrication plant in Pittsburgh got crushed by a beam destined for the Empire State, that didn't count. Not a construction site death. If a truck driver hauling limestone crashed on the way to the site, that didn't count either. The official number counted bodies that hit the ground inside the construction fence. Everything else was someone else's problem. Here's what we know for certain. A derrick operator fell 20 stories in September 1930. The cable snapped. He was hoisting a 2-ton steel beam. The beam dropped with him. Both hit the ground simultaneously. The beam embedded 3 feet into the earth. The man was unrecognizable. The crew stopped for 6 minutes while they pulled the body out. Then the whistle blew and work resumed. The replacement operator was at the controls by lunch. 2 men died in a single day in January 1931. Winter, the coldest month. One fell through an elevator shaft. The shaft was supposed to be covered. It wasn't. He stepped backward to dodge a swinging beam and went through, 80 feet straight down. The second man was struck by a falling rivet gun. Someone dropped it from 40 floors up. 60-pound pneumatic hammer. Terminal velocity. It crushed his skull through his hard hat. One man fell into wet concrete and drowned. This sounds impossible. Concrete isn't deep, but the foundation pores were 8 feet deep in places. He slipped off the forms. The concrete was dense enough to trap him, but fluid enough to cover his face. By the time workers pulled him out, he'd asphyxiated. The concrete was already setting. They had to chip him out. The pour continued. The schedule didn't allow for delays. 1 man was killed by a falling beam in the final month, April 1931. The building was nearly finished. He was a finisher, not a steel worker. A crane operator misjudged a swing. The beam clipped him. He went over the edge. No safety rail, no harness, nothing between him and Fifth Avenue except air. Those are the 5 official deaths. Here's what the official count didn't include. At least 3 workers died from falls that happened on site, but where death occurred later. Broken backs, crushed ribs, internal bleeding. They survived long enough to reach the hospital. The company sent flowers. The newspapers called them construction accidents, but didn't tie them to the building. The statistics stayed clean. 4 workers died at the fabrication plants. Steel mills are dangerous. Men get caught in rollers. Men get burned by molten metal. Men get crushed when cranes malfunction. If the beam was being cut for the Empire State Building when the accident happened, does that count? Starrett brothers said no. The families said yes. At least 3 deaths occurred in material transport. Truck crashes, rail accidents, a limestone quarry collapse in Indiana that killed 2 men cutting stone for the facade. These deaths were in the supply chain. They happened because of the building. But they didn't happen at the building. So they didn't count. The workers knew the real number. They always know. Bodies disappear from the line. Names stop appearing at the gate. Rumors spread. But nobody kept an unofficial tally. There was no worker newspaper, no union hall, no collective memory except what men shared over beers in Hell's Kitchen bars. And those stories died with the men who told them. The working conditions made death likely and survival lucky. The height alone was lethal. Men worked on steel beams 6 inches wide at elevations over 1,000 feet. No safety harnesses. Those didn't exist yet. Some men tied ropes around their waists and looped them over beams. But the ropes weren't rated for fall arrest. They were just psychological comfort. If you fell, the rope either snapped or cut you in half. Most men didn't bother. They relied on balance and focus. One gust of wind, one moment of distraction, one slick patch of morning frost. That's all it took. The riveting process was a daily gamble with disfigurement. Rivets were heated to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit in portable forges. The heater tossed them 40 feet through the air to the catcher. The catcher used a metal cone, but sometimes he missed. A white-hot rivet hitting bare skin didn't bounce off. It stuck. It burned through. Men lost fingers, lost hands. The forges themselves were fire hazards. They ran on coal. The smoke was toxic. Men breathed it for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Lung damage didn't show up for decades. When it did, nobody connected it to the building. The rivet guns caused permanent hearing loss. 130 decibels. Sustained. All day. No ear protection. By the end of the project, veteran riveters were partially deaf. They shouted to communicate. They couldn't hear the whistles. Foremen had to tap them on the shoulder to get their attention. The damage was irreversible. The company paid nothing for it. The winter cold was vicious at height. Wind chill at 1,000 feet in January dropped below zero regularly. Men wore leather gloves, but leather doesn't insulate at those temperatures. Frostbite was routine. Minor cases meant blackened fingertips. Severe cases meant amputation. The company doctor treated what he could. The rest went to Bellevue Hospital. If you couldn't work, you were replaced. No disability pay. No workers' compensation. That didn't exist yet federally. The summer heat was equally brutal. Steel beams in August sun reached 140 degrees. You couldn't touch them with bare hands. Gloves disintegrated. Men wrapped rags around their palms. Heat exhaustion was constant. Men collapsed. The foreman dragged them to shade, poured water on them, and sent them back up if they could stand. If they couldn't, they were replaced. Toxic exposure was invisible but pervasive. Lead paint, asbestos insulation, coal smoke, concrete dust. Nobody knew the long-term effects in 1930. Or if they knew, they didn't care. The effects wouldn't show up for 30 years. By then, the victims would be scattered. The company would deny responsibility. Proving causation would be impossible. The incentive structure made injury concealment rational. If you reported an injury, you might get medical treatment. You'd definitely get fired. So men hid injuries. Broken fingers were taped and ignored. Gashes were wrapped with rags. Respiratory problems were endured until they became fatal. The official injury count was a fraction of the reality, and the company had every reason to minimize both deaths and injuries. The Empire State Building was a propaganda project as much as a construction project. This was the Depression. Confidence was shattered. The building was supposed to prove that American capitalism still worked, that ambition hadn't died, that New York was still the capital of the world. Dead workers undercut that narrative. So the numbers were managed. Deaths were reclassified. Injuries were underreported. The press celebrated the safety record. Alfred E. Smith gave speeches about modern construction methods. The reality was buried with the bodies. The families got money, not much. A widow might receive $500 to $1,000 from the company. Call it a donation, not compensation. Donations are voluntary. Compensation implies liability. The company admitted no liability. Some families sued. Most settled. The amounts were confidential. The lawsuits disappeared from public record. No pensions, no long-term support, no college funds for the children, a lump sum, and a polite suggestion to move on. The men took the risks anyway, not because they were heroes, because they had no choice. 30% unemployment means you take the dangerous job or you starve. You climb the beam or you lose your apartment. You breathe the asbestos or your children don't eat. The decision wasn't brave. It was cornered. And the building didn't care. Buildings don't care. They're physics and capital. The human cost is externalized. Starrett Brothers paid for steel, concrete, and labor. They didn't pay for the decades of lung disease. They didn't pay for the widows. They didn't pay for the trauma of watching a coworker fall. Those costs were socialized. The families paid. The workers paid. Society paid when the veterans ended up disabled and destitute. Today, OSHA would halt the entire site after the first death. Investigations would take months. Fines would reach millions. The company would face criminal charges. This is moral progress. But it's worth naming the cost of that progress. One World Trade Center had 0 construction fatalities across 8 years. The Empire State had 17 across 13 months. We traded speed for those lives. It was the right trade. The company walked away clean. Under budget, ahead of schedule. A triumph of American engineering. We don't build like that anymore. And that's good. But we also don't build. Not at that speed. Not at that scale. Not with that conviction. We gained worker safety and environmental protection and legal accountability. We lost the capacity to move earth and steel at civilizational speed. Both things are true. Pretending otherwise is dishonest. The Empire State Building took 410 days. One World Trade Center took 3,137 days. That's not a rounding error. That's not inflation adjustment. That's a 765% increase in timeline for a building that's only 22% taller. The steel is stronger now. The cranes are bigger. The computers can calculate loads in seconds that took engineers weeks in 1930. Every tool is better. Every worker is safer. And yet we're 8 times slower. The machinery improved. The system collapsed. We can identify the exact moment it broke. January 1st, 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, signed into law by Richard Nixon. The law itself was 2 pages. The implications were infinite. From that point forward, any project involving federal funds or federal permits required an environmental impact statement. The EIS had to assess every possible effect on air, water, soil, wildlife, traffic, noise, and community character. The average EIS is now 600 pages long. The average completion time is 4.5 years. The Empire State Building's entire construction took less time than a modern environmental review. NEPA wasn't malicious. It was necessary. Before 1970, highways plowed through black neighborhoods without comment. Dams drowned valleys without assessment. Factories dumped poison into rivers without consequence. The damage was real. The law was corrective. But like all corrections, it overcorrected. The law required assessment, but it didn't define limits. So the assessments grew, and grew, and grew. A highway expansion that once took 6 months to approve now takes 6 years. Not because the engineering is harder, because proving you've considered every possible objection takes longer than building the actual road. And NEPA was just the beginning. 1971. The Occupational Safety and Health Act. OSHA. Federal Workplace Safety Standards. Mandatory safety equipment. Mandatory training. Mandatory documentation. Again, morally necessary. Workers were dying from preventable causes. But the documentation requirement became its own industry. A construction site that once had 1 safety inspector now has 5, plus 3 third-party consultants, plus continuous reporting. The safety work happens in addition to the construction work, not instead of unsafe construction work. The work got safer. The work also got slower. 1973, the Endangered Species Act. Projects could be halted if they threatened any protected species. The definition of threatened expanded over time. The definition of habitat expanded over time. A fish, a bird, a salamander, each one could stop a $1 billion project. The Tellico Dam was halted for the snail darter. The gray wolf stopped logging across the Northwest. The Delta smelt restricted California's water supply. Were these species worth protecting? Often, yes. Was the protection mechanism designed for speed? Absolutely not. The laws compounded. Each one added a new agency with veto power: Environmental Protection Agency, Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps of Engineers, Federal Aviation Administration, state environmental boards, county planning commissions. Each one had legitimate authority. Each one could say no. None of them could say yes alone. Approval required unanimous consent. Objection required a single voice. The system was designed to prevent harm. It succeeded. It also prevented motion. By 2000, building anything significant in America required navigating a procedural labyrinth. The Second Avenue subway in New York took 100 years from initial proposal to first segment completion. 1.8 miles. 15 years of active construction. Cost: $4.5 billion. The Empire State Building adjusted for length would have cost $200 million and taken 18 months. California High-Speed Rail was approved in 2008. 16 years later, 0 miles are operational. The current cost estimate is over $100 billion. The original estimate was $33 billion. No track has been laid in populated areas because the environmental reviews are still ongoing. The reviews have cost $10 billion alone. We're not building slower because we're dumber. We're building slower because we're required to prove we're not being dumb. And proving takes longer than doing. The cultural shift was equally profound. In 1930, an engineer's authority was technical. If the engineer said the beam would hold, the beam went up. If it failed, the engineer was liable. Professional responsibility was personal. Your reputation was the enforcement mechanism. If you cut corners and people died, you never worked again. After 1970, liability became legal. Engineers didn't just have to build safe structures. They had to prove in court that they'd considered every possible failure mode. Insurance costs exploded. Defensive engineering became standard. You didn't design the optimal bridge. You designed the bridge that couldn't be sued. Every decision required documentation. Every calculation required peer review. Every component required traceability. The engineers became more careful. The engineering became more expensive. Lawyers entered the process at every stage: contract lawyers, environmental lawyers, labor lawyers, liability lawyers, insurance lawyers. Each one added time and cost. Not because lawyers are evil, because legal risk is real. One lawsuit could bankrupt a contractor. One injury could end a career. The law created incentives for caution. Caution is the enemy of speed, and the public accepted this. We accepted it because the alternative felt reckless. We saw the photos of men walking on beams without harnesses. We saw the death tolls from dam projects and bridge collapses. We decided that speed wasn't worth bodies. That's a moral choice. It's the right choice. But it's still a choice. And choices have consequences, the consequences that we can't respond to civilizational threats at civilizational speed anymore. Climate change requires rebuilding the entire energy grid. We need thousands of miles of transmission lines. We need hundreds of gigawatts of solar and wind. We need it in 10 years, not 50. But the average utility-scale solar project takes 7 years to permit. The actual construction takes 18 months. We spend 5.5 years proving we're allowed to build the thing that could save us. The irony is suffocating. NEPA was created to protect the environment. Now it's the primary obstacle to environmental protection. Renewable energy projects are delayed by environmental reviews. Transmission lines are blocked by habitat concerns. Nuclear plants are strangled by procedural requirements that make construction economically impossible. We built the regulatory structure to prevent the problems of the past. We succeeded. We also built a machine that prevents the solutions to the problems of the future. Is there a middle ground? Maybe. Other countries have found balances. Japan rebuilt highways destroyed by earthquakes in weeks. China builds subways in 3 years that take us 20. France standardized nuclear reactor designs and built them in parallel. Each country cut through the procedural paralysis differently, but they cut through. The common thread is political will. When a society decides something must be built, it finds a way to build it. The regulations don't disappear. They get streamlined. The reviews don't vanish. They get time-limited. The safety standards remain. But the endless procedural loops get closed. America had that will in 1930. We had it in the 1940s during the war. We had it in the 1960s during the space race. We don't have it now. Not because we're weaker, because we've convinced ourselves that will itself is dangerous, that urgency leads to exploitation, that speed means suffering. Sometimes it does. The Empire State Building proved that. 17 men died so the building could rise in 13 months. That's unacceptable. We're right to reject it. But zero urgency also has a body count. It's just slower, more diffuse, harder to photograph. The coal plants that keep running while solar projects sit in permit hell kill people through air pollution. The bridges that collapse because we can't rebuild infrastructure fast enough kill commuters. The housing that doesn't get built because environmental reviews block density kills people through homelessness and displacement. We don't see those deaths as connected to the process. But they are. Delay is a decision. Caution has costs. We've chosen to make those costs invisible because they don't happen at construction sites. They happen in emergency rooms and homeless encampments and wildfire zones. The question isn't whether we should go back to 1930. We shouldn't. The question is whether we can find a third option, faster than now, safer than then, willing to build at the speed our problems demand. It would require rethinking NEPA, not repealing it, reforming it, time limits on reviews, automatic approvals if agencies miss deadlines, consolidation of overlapping jurisdictions, categorical exemptions for climate-critical infrastructure. It would require rethinking liability, safe harbor provisions for engineers following best practices, caps on damages for projects serving public interest, streamlined dispute resolution instead of endless litigation. It would require rethinking public input. Community voices matter. But every voice can't have veto power. At some point, elected officials have to decide and accept the political consequences. None of this is easy. All of it is possible. We just have to want it badly enough. The Empire State Building stands today as a monument to what American capitalism could do when speed was the imperative. 102 floors in 410 days, 17 men dead, thousands more injured, millions inspired. The building became the symbol of New York, the symbol of American ambition, the symbol of what was possible when nothing was allowed to stop you. We look at it now with mixed feelings. Pride in the achievement, horror at the cost, nostalgia for the speed, relief that we don't treat workers that way anymore. But there's one more feeling we should have. Urgency. Not the desperate, body-grinding urgency of the Depression. The purposeful urgency of a civilization that knows it's running out of time. We have fires to put out, grids to rebuild, cities to adapt. We can do it safely. We can do it quickly. We've just forgotten that both are possible at once. The Empire State Building proved we can move mountains when we decide to. It also proved we'll sacrifice anything to do it. The challenge now is remembering the first lesson without repeating the second. Can we build a skyscraper in 410 days anymore? No. Should we? That's the wrong question. The right question is, Can we build what we need at the speed we need it, without grinding people into dust? We haven't answered that yet. But the Empire State Building still stands, waiting for us to try.